back. I'm back after about almost a year, 9 or 10 months since I did the level 1 spell guide. This is now the Baldur's Gate Arcane Magic level 2 spell guide. And I'll just give a quick intro to recap how I go through these spells, and then we'll get right into discussing every level 2 mage spell in Baldur's Gate Enhanced Edition. So just as a reminder, I'm going to be going through these spells on the basis of Enhanced Edition, unmodded. I have played SCS, so I may comment on how certain spells work within SCS at times, but this is really focused on unmodded, Enhanced Edition, Baldur's Gate, and Baldur's Gate 2. And I'm going to take an analytical approach, talk a lot about numbers with a power gaming focus. And I do typically play solo, so that may bias what I say about different spells, but I'm trying to look at these from both a solo and party perspective. And with that, let's get into level 2. I'll just say thanks to everybody who commented on the level 1 spell guide. Hope some of you stick around and listen to this one. Hopefully I can get the audio balancing a bit better and otherwise improve this versus level 1. For example, by putting chapters into the video as soon as I upload it. So glad to be back. At this rate, I'll be through all 9 levels of Arcane Magic in about 7 or 8 years. But I'll probably be still playing this game in 7 or 8 years, so no big deal. Here we go, level 2, Arcane Magic. So I think before I get into each of the spells and ranking them on the 1 to 10 rating system that I'm using here, just a general comment, level 2 is probably the weakest Arcane Magic level, even after you normalize for the fact that different spell levels obviously should have different strength. There's just not too many spells here that have viability all the way through Throne of Ball. There's not too many spells here that are even super useful or a huge power spike as soon as you get them. The only exception might be the spell that I'm going to identify here as the clear best spell in level 2, which if you've played this game a lot, you probably have some guesses as to that. But level 2 on the whole, a pretty underpowered spell level, which means that a lot of these spells are going to be ranked down towards the bottom of the numbers here on the rating system. And really, if you're choosing between the top 5 or 6 spells to stock at this level, you're not going to really impact the power of your mage, just because there's nothing in this level that's absolutely essential, especially as you get into TOB and very high level spell casting. That said, let's get into the spells, and we're going in alphabetical order here as usual. So first spell is Agannazar's Scorcher. I don't think there's anything in the Baldur's Gate universe that will tell us which syllable to emphasize in Agannazar's. I say Agannazar's Scorcher. I'll just read the spell description and we'll get into reviewing it. So it has a range of 15 feet, duration of 1 round, casting time of 3, and the area of effect is this 2-foot by 15-foot jet. Probably the most recognizable thing about the spell, this stream of fire that will emanate in a straight line from the wizard. Upon casting this spell, a jet of flame appears at the caster's fingertips and bursts out towards one target of the caster's choice. That target will be hit by this flame for 3d6 points of damage. The flame jet strikes a second time halfway through its duration, and the caster may move while this spell is in effect. There is no saving throw against this spell, though anti-fire capabilities such as fire resistance will apply and may reduce or eliminate the damage. So this is a damage dealing spell. It's one of the first AoE or multi-target damage spells that the mage has access to. In vanilla Baldur's Gate, this spell used to have much higher damage output. I don't know why it was nerfed in EE. There was never a problem with this spell being overpowered. So it definitely did not need the nerf, but now we're left with this spell that only does 3d6 points of damage each time it hits. So for a total of 66 points of damage. So let's just talk about the strength and weaknesses of this spell for a second. So this, overall, this spell is probably the second best damage spell in level 2, with the best being Melf's Acid Arrow, although that spell is also pretty weak, and both of these spells are not what you're going to go to for damage spells. In fact, until very late COB, when you're stocking some Acid Arrow for reasons that I'll get into later, you probably don't want to be stocking any damage spells at level 2 at all for the entirety of your playthrough, and you're probably not going to have any through all of BG2 and most of BG1, just because this damage spell, like the other level 2 damage spells, is very weak versus the other choices here. It does hit multiple targets. The most effective way to use this is to get Boots of Speed on or Haste, and then hit a single target and immediately run your mage across the entire battlefield, hitting as many different targets as you can. And the nice thing about the spell is that each time it connects with the target, as long as you're within the duration in between the first strike and the second strike of fire damage, each time the jet intersects a new target, it'll hit that target. So you can actually hit more targets over a larger area with haste and boots of speed with this spell than you can with Fireball. And also it's easier to control than Fireball, because if you don't want to hit one of your own party members, you just start walking the other direction. So that is somewhat nice. You can get to a place where you're dealing over 100 damage with this spell if there are lots of different enemies. That's probably the best thing that you can say for this spell is that AoE capability and the possibility to use it with, in mid-game, a few levels after you initially get it, with Boots of Speed or Haste or a Potion of Speed to cut across a large group of enemies. That said, there's really two reasons that even if used optimally in that way, this spell is still pretty weak. The first one is just if you compare it to other AoE spells that you get shortly after this spell, like even Fireball at 5d6, or Fireball is 5d6 once you're level 5 with a save versus spell versus half. So on average, you're going to do more than the 3d6 that you get from Agannazar's here, at least on a single hit. And then Skull Trap scales much, much better through mid and late game, like through BG2 and TOB. So for damage spells, you're going to get access to ones in level 3 that are just easily superior and scale much better. And then the other reason why this spell is probably something that should never be in your book is that it's much worse than the Wand of Fire. And the Wand of Fire is easily available from early levels in BG1. You can just either have a cleric go into Sanctuary or cast Invisibility on yourself, or use an Invisibility potion and run into the Ankeg lair and grab the Fire Wand at level 1 if you want, pretty easily, and then scamper out of there. And once you have that Fire Wand, which is a really powerful item early in BG, so probably if you're power gaming and you're trying to max damage out of your mage at an early level, you are running in and getting that Wand of Fire pretty early. Once you have that wand, there's no reason to ever cast this spell anymore. The wand goes off instantly. It doesn't have a 3-round cast time, which is a big deal when you're in battle as a low-level mage. You're getting interrupted. You have bad armor class. You're probably getting interrupted a lot if enemies ever focus on you. So you need to be able to cast instantly. The wand does that. The Wand of Fire also does 6d6 plus 6 damage on its Scorcher Ray with a save versus wand for half. So even with the save made at 3d6 plus 3, that's still more damage than the 3d6 that Agannazar does each time it strikes. And I did test this with the Wand of Fire. It's 66 plus 6 each time, at the beginning of the spell cast and in the second phase when the ray strikes again. So Wand of Fire just does more damage at instant cast, about twice as much damage. Even if there's a save versus wand, the Wand of Fire still does marginally more damage because of the 3d6 plus 3. Also, Wand of Fire can be cast from a greater cast distance, which is a big deal when you're trying to tee up to have this this stretch across multiple enemies, and you don't want to get too close to them and have somebody potentially melee your mage. So the Wand of Fire is just better in every way. You're never short. It's hard not to be stingy with wand charges in this game, but the reality is, by the time you get to late BG1, you should have plenty of money to recharge your wands at different stores. And early in BG1, the Wand of Fire is available before you get Agannazar's. It's very powerful when you get it. It's very powerful through all of BG1, really, and it's just better than Agannazar's in every way. There's no way that this spell is better than the Wand of Fire. So this would be maybe a rating of 4 or 5 if the Wand of Fire didn't exist. But given the Wand of Fire does exist and it's easily available from level 1 from the Ankeg layer, and you can buy it. You can buy Wands of Fire in various places pretty early on in BG1 as well. That makes this spell just not very good. So I give it a 3 out of 10 just because it's really hard to justify over defensive spells in this level. It has no scalability, and the Wand of Fire is superior. Could be situationally useful against large numbers of enemies and as one of the first AoE spells, but just not something you're going to take. You got to be going to like the Svart village at level 3 before you get Skull Trap or Fireball and not have the Wand of Fire. And if you're doing that, you're probably not really power gaming anyway. So 3 out of 10. Next spell, Blur. Blur is lasts for it's a buff spell, lasts for 4 rounds plus 2 rounds per level, so a pretty nice duration on it, even from early levels as soon as you get it. Cast time of 2, a very quick cast time, and only affects the caster. When a blur spell is cast, the wizard causes the outline of her form to become blurred, shifting and wavering. This distortion causes all missile and melee attacks against the caster to be made with a -3 penalty. The wizard also gains a +1 bonus to all her saving throws. So first thing to note, this spell does have scalability because of the duration scaling at 2 rounds per level. It'll scale in duration through level 20, which means that when you're maxed out in the standard unmodded TOB XP cap, you can get to 44 rounds of this spell, which is about 4.4 minutes of real world time. That's long enough to clear the floor of a dungeon, go through a couple of very long fights. It's a good duration on this spell. And the two things that it does, both have some duration, have some utility all the way through the end of the game. A -3 AC penalty is pretty significant early to mid, early BG1 through mid BG2. After that, most enemies you're fighting are going to have absurdly low Thakos, and so armor class just starts to matter less. But the saving throw benefit on the flip side starts to matter a lot more as you go through the game and you start to face enemies that are using more abilities and more spells that require saves. So you have these two effects. They're both useful. They both have some utility to the end of the game, and one of them starts to get more useful, the saving throw side, as the AC bonus gets less useful. So this is a nice buff to have. I think that and this does make this one of the better spells in level 2. I think the overall problem with this spell is just comparing it to the alternative buff spell for defensive purposes in level 2, which is mirror image. We'll get to mirror image in a little bit, but it's hard to justify taking blur over mirror image when you're at lower to mid levels. Like all through BG1, would it be better to have mirror images up that are going to tank an entire hit for you with a pretty high probability, or to have 4 rounds plus 2 rounds per level of 3 better armor class? Definitely the mirror image is going to be superior. 3 better armor class, we're talking about D20 rolls here. So, maybe I guess that works out to probably a 15% lower probability of getting hit in most circumstances, versus mirror image. If you have 3 images up, that's a 75% lower probability of getting hit. And obviously, the mirror image probability declines over time as those images get hit. But just, you're the most important thing to you as a low level or mid level mage is avoiding damage, because any hit is extremely painful because you have low HP, and also you have to get your spells off. So you don't want to be interrupted. So that's why mirror image with that 75% or even higher if you have more images as you get to late BG1 and through BG2, mirror image is just superior. At low levels, all through BG1, mirror image is the better choice. If you're going into a really tough battle where you want to buff yourself to the max, then you probably put on blur and mirror image. But for routine use, just traveling around the lands, you're probably going to always stock mirror image over blur early game through mid game. And then by the time you get to later levels, when mirror image is less effective because you're fighting mages that have true sight and so forth, which also dispels blur, by the way. But by the time you get to much higher levels, like late BG2 or TOB, you have access to Stone Skin. So you might not be using mirror image as much, but at that point, the 3 AC is not really as significant anymore because enemies have very, very low Thakos and will hit you through it. So you do get the +1 saves buff, but is that enough to justify it over mirror image even at high levels? Probably not. Probably you're taking both of these at high levels, but mirror image is still the stronger spell. So I think this spell does have some utility. I always stock it and cast it on myself going into big battles, especially late in the game when level 2 becomes a bit of a wasteland, and you may as well take mirror image and this spell. But right when you get access to it, blur is not super powerful, and you're probably going to take mirror images over it every time. So for that reason, I give this a 6 out of 10. It's a decent spell, but not the strongest buff spell. And I think at lower to mid levels, mirror image does what this does better. If blur was in a good spell level, like level 3 or level 5, where there were a lot of great options, then it would be way lower than a 6. But 6 out of 10. Next spell, Deafness. Deafness has a casting time of 2. It affects 1 creature, and a saving throw negates it. The Deafness spell causes the recipient to become totally unable to hear any sounds. The victim is allowed a saving throw versus spell to negate the effect. Deafened spellcasters have a 50% chance to miscast any spells. This deafness can be done away with by means of a dispel magic spell or a cure disease spell. So this spell, first thing, the duration is special. So just to note, this spell, if you do get it off and you do hit somebody with this and they fail their save versus spell, the spell lasts indefinitely. So forever. Like deafness in real life. The permanent kind, not the kind you get after going to a concert. It lasts forever until dispelled. That's more trivia because it doesn't matter that the mage that you cast this on is still deaf 50 rounds later. No. Just to note how this interacts with Vocalize. So you would think that the level 2 spell Vocalize, if enemy mages have it cast on themselves, or if you have this cast on yourself, that because you don't need to speak to cast your spells when you're vocalized, that it wouldn't matter if you're deaf. So the 50% penalty should go away if you cast Vocalize. That's not the case. There's no interaction between Vocalize and deafness. Sort of doesn't make sense, but that's the way the game works. I tested this. So with those notes about how this works aside, conclusion on this spell sucks. It's a single target spell. The target gets a save, and you're probably trying to target a spellcaster with this, right? It's all about inhibiting the enemy's ability to cast spells. Well, you better be targeting a spellcaster, because otherwise this spell is not going to have any effect. So you're targeting a spellcaster. Spellcasters generally have higher save versus spells, so there's a good chance you do this and it has absolutely no effect. But even if you do get an enemy to fail their save, there's still a 50% chance that that enemy mage is going to get off their spell. And that's just too much RNG. If you're really trying to control fights, then anything that only has a 50% probability after the save is failed is going to be pretty useless to you. And if you compare this to other ways to inhibit or incapacitate enemy spellcasters, there's just so many better ways. You can hit them with a ton of magic missiles. You can hit them with a web spell. We'll get to web in a little bit here in level 2. That stuns with a save versus spell at -2. So if an enemy mage is inside a web AoE, they have to save every round at a -2 penalty. And if that save is failed, then the mage is stunned and has a 0 chance to cast any spells or do anything else. That's obviously much, much stronger than a single target 50% chance to miscast. Really useless spell. Can't see a situation where you would want to stock this, and I'll give it a 2 out of 10. Not one of the absolute worst spells in the game, but pretty close. Never take this. I guess the last thing I'll add about deafness is just that you have to compare this to the cleric spell Silence as well, which, unless enemy mages have Vocalize, is going to give them a 0% chance to cast spells against you, has an AoE, and has a large penalty to saves. So, and that's a level 2 cleric spell. If you have a cleric and you're focused on disabling mages, you're always going to cast Cleric Silence on them over this horrible deafness spell. All right, enough with that garbage. Next spell, Detect Evil. Oh, more garbage. This spell has a casting time of 2, a 30-foot radius, and the description is pretty short. This spell discovers emanation of evil from any creature. Any evil creature within the range of the spell will glow red briefly. So keep your eyes peeled when you cast this. So this spell is an made fun of spell. Deveorn, who has some great spell ranking videos, would call this RP tier. I think, is this one of the worst spells in the entire game? The answer to that is actually probably no. Simply because the most important thing that you need to know to help guide your choices in quests, or if you're on repeat playthroughs and you know the quests, but you want to know who you can kill, to know who you're going to have minus rep from killing, is whether they're evil. Generally in this game, if another character in the game is evil, then you can kill that character without consequence. And that's sometimes a useful thing to know. If you think somebody might have some loot on them, if you're just in the mood to kill some civilians, but you don't want it to cost gold, then this can be a useful spell. It does have a 30-foot radius, and there's no save versus spell. So, I think if you compare this to No Alignment, which I think we'll be getting to later here in level 2. Yeah, if you compare this to No Alignment, this is obviously much superior because there's no save and there's AoE, and all you really care about is whether somebody's evil. And No Alignment and this spell are the only ways in the game to know what any other character's alignments are. So I think this is the best spell to know whether enemies are evil. Just because there's no save means that, and there's an AoE, it's clearly better than no alignment. And yeah, there's some very limited use to this to figure out if you can kill people and take their loot without suffering minus rep. So I'm spending a lot of time defending this. This is still a garbage spell. That's 2 out of 10. There's not really a reason to take it. It's unless you're wondering whether you can assassinate somebody and take their gear without suffering minus rep. So it's obviously a highly limited use case, and you have to care about rep and the little bit of gold that it would cost you to get your rep back after killing somebody. That's Detect Evil. Next spell, Detect Invisibility. So this spell has a casting time of 2, 120-foot radius, so a giant radius, the entire screen or field of vision essentially. When the wizard casts the Detect Invisibility spell, she's able to see clearly any objects or beings that are invisible, as well as any that are astral, ethereal, or out of phase. In addition, none of those things have any significance in this game, by the way. There's only invisibility. In addition, this spell enables the wizard to detect hidden or concealed creatures, e.g. thieves hiding in shadows. It does not reveal the method of concealment or invisibility, except in the case of astral travelers, where the silver cord can be seen. Again, no relationship between that and the actual game. It does not reveal illusions or enable the caster to see through physical objects. Note, if an invisible creature enters the area of effect after the spell has already been cast, the creature will remain invisible. Right, because this is a point-in-time effect. It's a one-time dispel of invisibility, and if somebody came into the area afterwards, unlike True Sight or higher level invisibility detection spells, this spell would have no effect. So just to talk about what this does for a second. This spell does dispel hide in shadows and the regular level 2 mage spell invisibility, as well as people who are under the effects of invisibility potions. All those people will be revealed. The spell does dispel Shadow Door and also improved invisibility. So you're talking now about eliminating up to level 5 spells. It does not dispel the caster's own improved invisibility, for example. So that's somewhat handy. You can be in improved invisibility and you can let this go off and it's not going to impact yourself. It also doesn't dispel your party members. So this is party friendly. You can have party members that are invisible or in the shadows and cast this and you won't dispel on them, only on enemies. So I think overall this spell, it's the first spell that you have access to as a mage that's going to reveal invisible enemies, and it has a quick cast time of 2. So there is some utility here, especially because it'll affect improved invis and Shadow Door, which enemy mages will cast on themselves even in BG1, and increasingly so if you have SCS installed. Later on, there's really no scalability to this spell because you're going to get True Sight, which is the best illusion dispelling spell in the game. And once you get that, you're never going to come back to Detect Invisibility in all likelihood. But when you're low level and remove/dispel magic won't work very often, this spell could be the only way that you have to bring enemy mages or enemy thieves out of invisibility. And in BG1, we've all been in a scenario where there's an improved invis mage that's just wreaking havoc because the mage can't be targeted with your own spells while they're invisible. So this is situationally useful, much more useful early on in the saga. You might plan ahead for certain fights where you're going to be facing thieves, or you're going to be facing especially mages that will cast Improve Invis or Shadow Door and stock a couple of these. But this is not an essential spell by any means. I think the fact that the spell level 2 as a whole is so weak means that there's room for 1 or 2 of these maybe if you're low level. but it's situationally useful at best, and has no scalability once you get to more powerful invisibility dispelling spells later on. So I give this spell a 5 out of 10 for detect invisibility. By the way, when I get to the spell non-detection, I'll go back and cover how this spell interacts with non-detection, because it gets quite complex, but we'll get into that in subsequent guides. Next spell, Ghoul Touch. Casting time of 1, and this affects the caster. This is another weapon creation or palm or touch attack. When the caster completes this spell, a red glow encompasses her hand. When the wizard makes a successful melee attack against a creature, that creature is punched. For 1d2 fist damage, strength bonuses apply, and must make a saving throw of her spell or be paralyzed for 5 rounds. So this spell, it may be one of the better touch spells. I already talked in the level 1 guide why touch spells are horrible for mages. Of course, you have to have decent THAC0 and be able to successfully make a melee attack to begin with. Also, the second that you cast this, any weapon you have equipped is gonna go away, and you'll be left with this spell's icon in its place, meaning that you're gonna lose all of the buffs off of whatever your primary weapon is. Those are great reasons alone never to stock this spell. If you look more closely at what this does, ghouls and the ability to do their attack initially seem appealing, because God knows ghouls have killed me so many times with this paralyzation effect. It seems like whenever I cast Ghoul Touch, I never paralyze anybody, but whenever a ghoul comes up to my character, their first attack is a guaranteed fail the saving throw and then die for my character. But the reality is, even against low-level enemies that have bad saves, this spell is no good when cast on your own mage. And I have tried this. I have tried to build like a fighter mage centered around using Ghoul Touch to paralyze enemies, and it just doesn't work. Early on, if you're pure class, you have only 1 APR, so you have 1 chance to get this off per round. It only lasts for 5 rounds, so that's it. You have 5 shots to attack, and the enemy is going to save. Even low-level enemies that have low save or spell, they're going to save about half the time. So, you have 5 rounds to hit, and then even if you hit, the enemy has to save. A lot of times you're just going to whiff 5 times or have enemies save, and this spell is going to have no effect. And if you are a fighter mage, obviously there are much stronger weapons that you could be equipping to take advantage of your multiple attacks per round. The other point that is important to note here, which I think makes this spell even more of a joke and is significant, is that you're doing fist damage when you attack with this spell. So you actually cannot kill anybody while you have this spell up. I guess theoretically that makes it a bit better for party play. If you're doing party play, I don't know why you're sending your low-level mage in to do melee. But if you're playing solo, like I do a lot, even if you successfully paralyze somebody, then you can't actually kill them with your main hand attack while you have this spell up. You'll just get them down to 1 hit point, and fist damage is not lethal in Baldur's Gate. So that's a joke as well. You'd have to have an offhand weapon equipped and wait until you actually hit with the offhand. So on the whole, just because of the paralyze effect and the fact that stunned enemies get hit every time automatically, there's no need to attack roll. This spell is probably one of the better touch spells, and it's better than the level 1 touch spells, but it's still a horrible spell. 2 out of 10. No reason to take it. Next is Glitterdust. Glitterdust has a duration of 4 rounds, a range of 30 feet, and an area of effect of 15 feet. So it's an AoE spell. It cast time of 2, pretty quick cast time. This spell creates a cloud of glittering golden particles within the area of effect. All enemies in the area must roll a successful saving throw for a spell or be blinded, i.e. have a -4 penalty to attack rolls and armor class for 4 rounds. In addition, all enemies who fail their saving throw are covered by the dust, which cannot be removed and continues to sparkle until it fades, thus revealing invisible creatures. The dust fades in 4 rounds. All right, so let's look at this spell a bit more closely. First, breaking it down, there's 2 effects here. Number 1, there's an AoE blindness. So I'll just talk about the other one is a detect invisibility effect. So I'll talk about each of these separately. The first effect, AoE blindness. So, following up on the blindness discussion over the level 1 spell, blindness. Blindness is a powerful thing to do to enemies. If they can't see you, they can't attack you, they can't cast spells on you, and they'll likely just stand there and not do anything and wait to die. Blindness, the level 1 spell, is only a single target, but it lasts forever, whereas Glitterdust here only lasts for 4 rounds. 4 rounds is probably not enough to get through an entire fight with tough enemies. And the other problem is that there's a save or spell here, so you're not going to be catching all your enemies, right? It's going to work about half the time at low levels. So if you're looking for crowd control at low levels, then probably you would always cast Sleep, the level 1 spell, instead of this spell, because Sleep has longer duration, a similar save, so there's not really a difference there. And if enemies sleep, then you're going to hit them 100% of the time, and they can't attack you back, even from melee. Whereas if you blind them, you don't get you get a bonus to attacking them, because they're going to have this -4 penalty to armor class, but it's not as good as sleeping enemies where you have a guaranteed hit every time. So if you're thinking about crowd control, then Sleep, I think, is just better than Glitterdust. The second effect here, the detect invisibility, theoretically it's helpful to repeatedly bring enemies out of the shadows, for example, or invisibility. For example, thieves that are popping potions every time their invisibility is dispelled, because this dust, if the save is failed, will attach to the enemy and then dispel them 4 times over the 4 rounds. However, if the enemy failed their save to Glitterdust, then they're blind anyway, so they're probably not going to be able to come attack you. So the detect invisibility becomes superfluous. And when you're trying to get enemies out of invisibility because they're about to come hit you for a huge backstab multiplier, you absolutely do not want to be casting a spell like this one that has a save versus spell to have any impact. It's going to do you no good if your last resort to not get backstabbed is to cast Glitterdust, and when you do, the enemy thief just saves and comes and kills you. Compared to the level 2 spell we were just discussing, Detect Invisibility, which has no save. It's guaranteed. So there's really, so I think in summary, if you're trying to incapacitate enemies, then you'd be better off with a web or a sleep spell, or even the level 1 blindness spell. If you're trying to detect enemies that are invisible, then you're going to be much better off just casting Detect Invisibility. So either of it's sort of like a poor man's version of both of these things, crowd control and Detect Invisibility. I've definitely read before that this is a decent spell. I don't know. I feel like that's just a hipster view that doesn't actually look at the alternatives and what you're trying to accomplish. It's not absolutely useless, but if you want predictability and you're power gaming, then you want to be casting things that have penalties to saves, like web. You don't want to be casting and Detect Invisibility. You don't want to be casting things that last for 4 rounds only and have a save versus throw, a save versus spell to negate. So 2 out of 10 for Glitterdust. Not a good spell. Not worth stocking over much clearly better spells at level 2 like Web or Detect Invisibility that do the same things. Next up is Horror. Horror has a casting time of 2. It operates over a 15-foot radius circle. All enemies within the area of effect when this spell is cast must save their spell or flee in terror. Certain creatures are immune to the effects of fear, including all undead. So everybody knows this spell well because it can be devastating when cast against you. Who doesn't remember dying to Tarnesh outside the friendly arm over and over when he casts this spell on your party and you're low level and you all fail saves. But in practice, this is a pretty inferior crowd control methodology versus other crowd control methods like Sleep or Web that are superior. The duration is very long, one turn or 10 rounds is a very long time to have your enemies running around in fear and not attacking you. But it's very difficult to kill enemies that are impacted by this spell as compared to Sleep or Web, which stun enemies, keeping them in one place and giving you guaranteed hits against them. If an enemy is fleeing in terror, especially if they have haste, it's going to be real hard to catch up with them and actually hit them. So you would spend a lot of that 10 rounds just trying to find the enemy, which is just not that fun and not that effective, unlike Web or Sleep, where the enemy is going to be stuck there and at your mercy. So, and it's a spell that's annoying when cast against you and seems like it would be fun, but in practice just results in you chasing enemies around for 5 to 10 rounds, and then at the end when the spell wears off, probably not being that much better off. Of course, this is all talking about really BG1 and early BG2. Once you get to mid BG2 or TOB levels, almost all enemies are going to be either completely immune to fear, just hard-coded in the game, or they're going to have resist fear up, or they're just going to have such low save or spell threshold that they're going to be saving versus the spell. So there's just no scalability into late game, making the spell even worse on top of being inferior to other options at the level that you get it. 2 out of 10 for Horror. Next level 2 spell is Invisibility. Invisibility has a special duration, which is actually 24 hours of in-game time, so super long. You're always gonna come out of invisibility by doing something that takes you out of it before this ever wears off. So it's a 24-hour in-game duration, cast time of 2, area of effect 1 creature, and instead of reading the long spell description here, I'll just explain what this does. Makes the character that's cast upon, which can be the caster or any other character in the game, invisibility until that character does something that impacts the outside world and is going to therefore break the invisibility, such as opening a door, disarming a trap, opening a chest, talking to an enemy, or casting a spell on any enemy or any other character, or attacking. So, this is really about 2 things. It's about avoiding or escaping from nasty fights for your mage against lower level enemies that don't have access to, they can't see through invisibility and don't have access to invisibility dispelling spells. You can go through entire areas and never have to fight if you have this spell up. And then the second thing is for mage thieves or for mages that are supporting other thieves in their party, this spell can be used to send those thieves into invisibility so that they'll have access to backstab and backstab multipliers. Probably the best use of this spell though is for the first purpose, avoiding tough enemies. And early on in the game, the best use for this spell I've really found is early on in the game, you can use it to snatch some really powerful items that are protected by powerful enemies that you otherwise wouldn't be able to get past at super low level. Like as soon as you get level 2 spells, you could go grab the Constitution manual in the Flesh Golem cave in the lighthouse area to give yourself +1 con and some more HP early on. Maybe the most important one is the Wand of Fire in the Agkeg lair, which is really game changing when you get it and allows you to fight much higher level enemies as a low level mage. You could also grab the Manual of Charisma in the Knoll area if you wanted, and I'm sure there's other examples. So this is a decent spell for that purpose. Gets you access to some really powerful items early on in the game. The scalability isn't really there further on into the saga. Obviously at level 4 you're getting improved invisibility, which is better in every way, so you're probably not casting this at all once you get to improved invisibility. So this is sort of situational BG1 type spell that has a few uses early on in the saga, and then you're probably not going to cast it again. And I'll just note one sort of note on how this works. At least in the version of Enhanced Edition that I have installed, this can actually be combined with improved invisibility. So if you're improved invisible and then you cast a spell or do something to break the full invisibility of improved invisibility, but you're still partially invisible through the improved invis, then you can still actually become fully invisible again by casting this level 2 spell on yourself once your full invisibility from improved invis is gone. So, I think if you're worried about escaping and you don't have access to invisibility potions, then this can be helpful even at higher levels, because if you've come out of full invis, out of your improved invisibility, you can cast this on yourself to go full invis again so enemies truly can't see you and then run away. All in all, situationally useful spell, doesn't really have any scalability, but is powerful for avoiding enemies, avoiding pain in the ass areas that have a lot of RNG that can kill you, like Cloakwood, and the very long duration makes it nice to have in early to mid to late BG1. So 5 out of 10 for invisibility. Decent spell. Next up is Knock. Knock has a casting time of 1, and the area of effect is a single locked door or chest. The Knock spell opens locked, held, or wizard locked doors. It opens secret doors as well as locked boxes or chests. It does not raise barred gates or similar impediments. In reality, what this spell does is it'll open any lock that's pickable in the game. So if there's certain doors or locks that can't be picked because they're important to the plot of the game and you need to get an item, for example, to go through them, then Knock is going to be of no use to you. But any door or chest that can be lockpicked can be opened with 100% certainty through a Knock spell. Now, maybe it's just that I solo more, but I do think that this spell is underrated and is a really good spell, even if you're playing with a party. And obviously, the spell doesn't have a ton of scalability through TOB when you're going to have more thief points than you know what to do with if you have any thieves in your party, and you're going to be able to bash or lockpick every pickable door or chest in the game. But even through BG2 and certainly through BG1, even if you have thieves in your party, you probably do not want to allocate points to lockpick versus your other options. You want to have hide in shadows, and you want to have move silently so that you can stealth and do backstab damage. You want to have set traps. Traps are really powerful, even at lower to mid levels. And you also want to have detect traps and disarming traps so that you can get through dungeons without dying. All of those things are much more important than having access to high lock picks. And so early on and through mid game, through mid BG2, if you're really optimizing your thief builds or your dual class mage or multi-class mage thief builds, you're probably allocating all of your thief points to things other than lockpicks. And this, having access to this spell allows you to do that. You can easily power game by putting all your party's points into stealth, detect traps, etc., and then just rely on one sorcerer or one mage that has access to this knock spell to open chests that you can't bash. And that's pretty powerful. Simply because there's lots of money and lots of items behind higher, harder to open chests. And I think the game intended that you not be able to open those until you're pretty high level and you've put a lot of points into lockpick. But having access to this spell can sort of short circuit that. BG1 doesn't actually make this scroll available until you can pick it up in Deveorn's lair after Cloakwood. If you think about that, that's a really long time to wait to get access to a level 2 spell. This is one of the only level 2 spells that's not sold in High Hedge, for example. And that's because the spell does allow you to get access to some powerful items much earlier than you should be able to. There's a Cloak of Protection +1 that's in a house in the zombie area north of Worm's Crossing that you can get to with this spell. There's a Wand of Lightning in Durlag's Tower that you can get to with this spell. Otherwise, you would need to have a Thief that's pretty leveled and where you put all the Thief's initial points into lockpicks, which is horrible for that Thief. So this spell is really nice to have to get access to some great loot and powerful items early on in the game. If you're a sorcerer and you can pick it up as soon as you get level 2 spells, then you sort of break the, I don't want to say game breaking because getting a Cloak of Protection +1 or a Wand of Lightning is not game breaking, but you do sort of get access to loot that the game didn't intend you to have access to because you can go get that Wand of Lightning at a very low level, for example, versus waiting till after Cloakwood. So this is a spell. If you're soloing, then I think it's really important, and you always want to have 1 or 2 stocked so you can get access to loot and money that you wouldn't otherwise be able to at all because you have no thief. Even if you have thieves, then I think it's still an extremely helpful spell because you really don't want to allocate points to lockpicking if you don't need to. This is probably the number 3 most commonly used spell for me at this level after Blur and Mirror Image. So I have to stand up for Knock and give it a 6 out of 10 rating, say that it's underrated, and 100% probability of anything is very strong in this game, and this gives you access to a thieving skill as a low level mage that thieves could only have if they heavily allocated into lockpicks and nerf themselves by not putting into much more important categories. So, great spell. 6 out of 10. Next spell, No Alignment. Casting time of 9, area of effect 1 creature, and a saving throw negates. You could almost stop reading there. You know that a spell is going to suck as a level 2 spell if it has a cast time of 9, affects 1 creature, and a saving throw completely negates it. Let's look at what this does, though. A No Alignment spell enables the mage to exactly read the aura of a creature. If the creature rolls a successful saving throw over a spell, the caster learns nothing about that particular creature from the casting. When a character is hit by this spell, he will glow red if evil, green if good, and white if neutral. Certain magical devices negate the power of the No Alignment spell. I don't know what that means. Magic resistance does negate this, as with the other alignment-seeking spells, but I think that reference to magical devices is not true. I don't think there's a single item, at least that is droppable in the game that negates the spell. Oh, what is there to say? This is complete trash. This is one of the worst spells in the game, truly. Single target, cast time of 9, The only time you'd ever want to know somebody's alignment is for role-playing purposes, or the only thing that, the only reason you want to know if you're not role-playing is so that you can know if you can kill them and take their items and not suffer minus rep. But if that's your goal, then you should just cast Detect Evil and get the entire area to glow red if they're evil without a save, right? The only difference with no alignment is that you get to know whether the enemy or whether the other character you're casting it on are they neutral or are they good, which makes no difference, really. I don't know of any example of a non-player character in this game that if they're neutral, you can slaughter them with no negative consequences versus if they're good. It just matters evil versus neutral and good. So can't really think of a use case for this. It's single target and there's a saving throw, so you could stock this up and try your best to see what alignment somebody is, casting it multiple times and come away with nothing. Joke spell. And there's really no utility, even for the extremely limited use case of finding out if you can kill people and suffer minus rep. You should clearly use Detect Evil, not no alignment. 1 out of 10, one of the worst spells in the game. Next up is Luck, an interesting one. Duration of 3 rounds, so very, very short duration that does not scale. Casting time of 2, area of effect 1 creature, no save. The recipient of this spell gains an extraordinary luck for the next 3 rounds, receiving a +1 bonus to her saving throws, attack rolls, and minimum damage / healing rolls, as well as +5% to all thieving skills. Furthermore, damage dice for all effects outside of weapons-based damage is reduced by 1. For example, a 66 fireball will do 65 damage, and a flaming longsword that deals 1d8 +2 slashing plus 1d3 fire damage will deal 1d8 +2 slashing plus 1d2 fire damage instead. That almost must be an error in the description there. Luck would actually reduce the fire damage output in that example. I see. I think what it's talking about is attacks against the person who's been affected by the luck spell. That must be what it's discussing. In any event, the description here is not particularly helpful as to what this spell actually does. I'll try to get into that a little bit here, looking through the rule set and how the game is coded. Because luck actually affects many more things than only the things described here in the description. And it's an important game mechanic that I didn't really focus on until years after I started playing this game. So what is luck and what does it affect? So luck is a concept that's built into the coding of the game that if it's toggled up, various roles and RNG-based effects in the game become more favorable to you as the player, and if it's toggled down, they become more against you as the player. An example of something that toggles luck down is being fatigued. So if you ever felt like when you're fatigued, nothing's going your way, you die more easily, you can't make attack rolls. The answer to that is basically yes. You're not fantasizing. Fatigue actually reduces luck, and as you get more fatigued, your luck reduces further. So this game mechanic of luck, it can toggle down against you as well as toggling up in your favor, which is what this spell does. So what does luck actually affect? So it affects almost everything. It affects outgoing physical attack rolls, outgoing physical damage rolls, healing rolls, incoming spell damage rolls, incoming on-hit effect damage rolls. So for example, if somebody has a weapon that has plus elemental damage and they're attacking you with it. And also there's this concept of initiative, or there being RNG around how fast your characters react to certain commands that you might give them. And luck reduces time that it will take for your characters to react to those commands that involve moving to another creature or moving to attack another creature, which is a very minor effect, but is an effect. So to sum up all the different things that luck does, it emerges that getting +1 to luck or +1 to all these things, a 1 pip movement in your favor on all these things is pretty massive. It's like getting +1 to saving throws, +1 to armor class, +1 to damage, +1 to 2-hit rolls, and 5 to 30% damage resistance for all types of damage, given the reduction in damage rolls that would impact your hit points and reduce your hit points. That's pretty huge. It does not apply to outgoing spell damage rolls. Otherwise, this spell would be really powerful when you're rolling, 10d6 on a fireball or skull trap. It doesn't impact outgoing spell damage rolls. Maybe the developers decided that would be too powerful, but it does impact spell rolls that are coming at you. So for example, if a spell is based around a d6, such as a skull trap or a fireball, then having luck up is going to reduce that d6 to a d5 effectively, because each damage roll against you is going to be reduced by 1. So that ends up looking like 1/6 or about 16% damage reduction to all types of damage that are being generated through the roll of a d6. That's obviously really powerful. For a level 2 spell especially, that's very powerful. Just ignoring everything else about the spell for a second, that effect is very powerful. Plus you add in the saving throws, AC, all these things just make your character more powerful in a little bit, but along lots of different parameters. The other effect that luck has that I didn't list here, but which is important, is that with +1 luck, mirror image will always tank the hit instead of there being a probabilistic chance of whether mirror image is going to tank the next successful attack against the mage. So that's pretty significant too, right? If you have mirror image up and you increase your luck by 1, then your mirror image starts to work exactly like stone skin. You know you're not going to get hit with certainty until all the mirrors have gone away. That's very significant for protecting yourself from being interrupted as a low to mid-level mage. Now, all that said, these are all the reasons why luck is super powerful. It has significant damage reduction in the end. It gives you various buffs. But looking at this spell, the obvious problem with it is the 3-round duration. 3 rounds, extremely short time. It doesn't scale at all. You're gonna get to cast 3 spells while you're under the effects of luck. If you're lucky, there might be 3 AoE or magic spells cast against you that you get to reduce slightly through the damage reduction. But even in the heat of battle, there's just not many things that this is going to affect given the only 3-round duration. And especially once you get to late game and all your other buff spells are scaling with time and this is not, that 3 rounds stands out even more. If you're in the heat of battle and you see a fireball or an Abidalzim's Horde Wilting coming at you or a Finger of Death and you need to save yourself, you're not going to cast the spell. You're not going to cast the spell because it just gives you that +1. It doesn't actually negate whatever the effect is. So even in the heat of battle where you're trying to react live and take advantage of the short duration, you're still not going to choose this over other options. So it's sort of an odd one. Some very powerful effects, but the developers decided that it'd be too powerful to give all those buffs for any significant period of time, and what you end up with is this sort of bastardized spell that's very powerful, but that only lasts for 3 rounds and doesn't scale at all. The last note I'll make on this, a couple things. All of these buffs do are also created. The +1 luck is also created by the divine spell chant at level 2. It lasts for 1 turn or 10 rounds, so 3.3 times as long as this spell, and it affects your entire party instead of one character. So chant is obviously superior to this. It's also a level 2 spell. And chant has a reasonable duration. It could last for most of a fight or maybe even all the fight if you finish off your enemies quickly. Chant makes sense. That's a spell that's worth casting, that's pretty powerful. Luck duration is just too short and single target versus chant, so clearly inferior. And the one other thing to note is in Siege of Dragonspear, there's this item that you can buy from the genie that you bring into the coalition camp with the spectacles of spectacle, and that belt's called Cloverleaf. Cloverleaf's has a permanent luck effect. So there's a similar ring that you buy from that same vendor, which I think only good characters can use, which is called the Ring of Purity, that imposes a permanent chant effect. Both of those items are very powerful because they give the very strong buffs of the luck spell, but on a permanent basis. It's just a status effect that you get while you have the item up. That's hugely powerful. You're talking about the 5 to 30% damage reduction for all types of damage, +1 to AC, +1 to damage, +1 to hit rolls, +1 to saving throws, all that stuff. Never having mirror images fail to block an attack that is successful against you. You get those permanently with Cloverleaf or the Ring of Purity. So just noting that, that's not to be underrated. I think it makes Cloverleaf clearly the best belt in the game. If you're playing Siege of Dragonspear with the trilogy, then you buy that belt. You make sure to equip it on your main character, or what a character probably is best on a tank because of the damage reduction properties, but it's the most powerful belt in the game. This spell, on the other hand, with its 3-round duration, is no good, and there's really no reason to stock it over buffs that scale better and have more realistic durations, like Blur and Mirror Image. So 2 out of 10 rating for this spell, but interesting one to understand the effects of. Next up is Melf's Acid Arrow. Duration of 1 round for every 3 levels, a cast time of 2, area of effect 1 creature. By means of this spell, the wizard creates a magical arrow that speeds to its target unerringly. The arrow has no attack or damage bonus, but inflicts 2d4 points of acid damage. There is no splash. For every 3 levels of the caster, the acid lasts for another round unless somehow dispelled, inflicting another 2d4 points of damage each round. So at 3rd through 5th level, the acid lasts 2 rounds. At 6th through 8th level, the acid lasts for 3 rounds, and so on. Okay, this spell, a spell that's cast against you many times, and when cast against you is highly annoying. It'll interrupt your casting as a mage. So one that when I was first playing this game, I was excited to finally get my hands on. And it is the best damage spell at this level. It's the best all-around damage spell at this level. That's not saying much because there's really only 2 that are of any utility, Agannazar's and this one, and neither of them is very good. That said, what can we say that's positive about this spell? It does have scalability. In the default game, no mods. The 2d4 acid damage each round will max out at level 21, lasting for 8 rounds at that time. So by the time you get to be very high level in TOB, you're talking about 2 to 8 damage per round for 8 rounds, or a total of 16 to 64 damage, which is not nothing. Obviously, 8 rounds is an eternity when enemies are using high-level abilities and dropping time stops on you and so forth, but there is some scalability there, which, finding a decent spell that has any scalability at level 2 is hard. I think the theoretical use case for this is that you try to cast it on enemy mages and interrupt them every round, interrupt their spell casting. But No, in reality, I haven't really found much of a practical use for that. Most enemy mages will have improved invisibility up or minor globe up. Generally, if you can dispel those buffs such that they'd be vulnerable to a Melf's acid arrow, then you're much better off hitting them with something that's going to kill them instantly, like a skull trap with its high damage output, a flame arrow, or a magic missile that is going to have do a higher damage and have a better chance of interrupting their spell casting. So I think overall, the spell's not horrible, but in the early and mid game, there are better solutions for taking down higher damage solutions that do damage more quickly for taking down enemies, including enemy mages. The one interesting thing to say about this spell at high levels is I think it actually steps back into having some utility in very late playthroughs of the trilogy in TOB, where because of the cast time of 2, and at that level you probably need fewer instances of blur and mirror image because they last a long time. Enemies are casting true sight anyway, so you sort of have a void at level 2 where you're not sure what to choose. At high TOB, Acid Arrow is actually not bad. And the only reason I'll say that is because you face certain enemies, certain of the ball spawn in late TOB that have extremely, extremely high resistances to all damage types. Think, at least in SCS, Yagashura is like this, and Balthazar is like this, and then when you fight them again at the very end of the game with Ascension installed or different mods that make the end fight more difficult, the same is true. You're facing these enemies that have 90% plus magic resist, or 90% plus damage resist to every type of damage in the game. And when you're facing an enemy like that, the entire goal is just to hit them, create as many instances of hitting them with any type of damage as possible. Because each instance is probably only going to do 1 or 2 damage anyway, even if it's, hitting for 60 or 100. And in that universe, it's actually a nice tactic to cast Improve Alacrity on your mage. You have Vecna, of course, an Amulet of Power, plus any other items from mods. So you're easily casting acid arrows immediately, and you're under improved alacrity. So you could get off 6 or 7 of these things against a single enemy that has very high resistances. And against that enemy, you're going to be doing the 1 damage from each acid arrow per round, and there's no save to it, and it'll last for 8 rounds. So if you can get off 6 or 8 of these things, if you get off 6 of them, then you're doing 6 damage per round for 8 rounds against that enemy. And that's not nothing. That's as much as a 5 APR fighter that's doing 50 damage per hit is going to do against these enemies that have 90% plus resist to all damage types. And you can do it instantly like that inside an Improved Alacrity, given the 0 cast time with Vecna, or even Amulet of Power and one other item that reduces cast speed by 1 from mods. So late TOB, I do think this is situationally useful against some of the most powerful enemies in the game. It's sort of ironic. It's a spell that sucks for, or is middling at best for most of the saga, and then has this use against some of the most powerful enemies you'll ever face. But those are the facts. Overall, I'll give this spell a 5 out of 10. At lower levels, you're always going to want to take Mirror Image over this and protect yourself so that you can get off better damage spells like Magic Missile or Skull Trap. But it's not a horrible spell, and it has to be respected as the best damage spell at this level. Plus, you have this very late game use with Improved Alacrity, which is something. So 5 out of 10. Next up, we're finally here, although the conversation has been dominated by this spell to this point, just because it's clearly the best level 2 spell. And that spell is Mirror Image. The duration is 3 rounds, plus 1 round per level. Cast time of 1, so really quick cast time. You can get it off in battle. Area of effect, it says special, but it just affects the caster. When a mirror image spell is invoked, the caster causes from 2 to 8 exact duplicates of herself to come into being around her. These images do exactly what the wizard does. Since the spell causes a blurring and slight distortion when cast, it is impossible for opponents to be certain which are the illusions and which is the actual wizard. When an image is struck by a melee or missile attack, magical or otherwise, it disappears, but any other existing images remain intact until they are struck. However, it is important to note that this will not protect the caster against every attack, as it is possible for an enemy to choose the real caster among all the images. So that description sort of explains what this spell does, but doesn't get too specific with it, doesn't tell you the odds, so that's what I'll try to go through now. First off, again, I'll repeat it, this is the best level 2 spell. Any spells that are going to completely absorb attacks or physical damage against the mage are really important because you can't get interrupted and you have very limited HP. As a mage, if you can avoid getting hit by physical attacks, you're going to chew through almost all the enemies in the game, certainly through BG1 and mid BG2, before you start facing enemies with a lot of elemental attacks, spells they're casting, special abilities. Avoiding physical damage on your mages is super important and allows them to do everything else that they do well. So this is the best level 2 spell, a great spell. You take it as soon as you get access to it, and it helps you survive fights and take on enemies you wouldn't otherwise be able to because they would chop you into bits with physical damage. So the spell does scale through level 20, in both in terms of duration and the number of images. In terms of duration, at level 20, you can keep this up for 23 rounds, so that's 2.3 minutes of real-world time. So that's enough for part of a dungeon or a full fight, even a long fight. So pretty good duration. And the addition of the extra images is also powerful scaling. With the maximum of 8 duplicates, there's only a 1 in 9 chance of the mage being hit, or 11%. So the description isn't specific about this, but the way these duplicates work is that the chance of being hit when the duplicates are up is always going to equal 1 divided by the number of duplicates plus 1. The plus 1 being your actual real body. So if you have 8 of these, the maximum up, the chance of being hit is 1 in 9. And that hit is only going to eliminate 1 of the mirror images, taking you down to 7 mirror images plus yourself, at which point there will be a 1 in 8 chance of getting hit. So the scaling helps this spell last for longer and also makes it incrementally less likely each time, immediately after you've cast the spell, that you'll take the hit. As I noted a second before when I was talking about luck, if you have luck up, or more likely you have a chance spell or the Ring of Purity or Cloverleaf on, the attacks will always hit the images first, regardless how many images there are. So sort of an important synergy there that turns this level 2 spell into a stone skin, basically, if you have that belt on or you're under a chant spell, which is really powerful for a level 2 spell. To just note the interaction between this spell and some other spells for a second. First of all, you may remember the crappy level 1 spell Reflected Image, which creates a single image. It's a very poor man's mirror image. You actually cannot have that spell up and this one up at the same time. So if you are under the effects of mirror image and you cast Reflected Image will cancel the mirror image and reset you to having a single reflected or mirror image instead of the up to 8 that you'd have with mirror image. So never cast Reflected Image, period. It's a horrible spell with no scaling, but certainly don't cast it when you have a mirror image up. With respect to spells cast against a wizard that is protected by mirror image, in Enhanced Edition, at least on my testing, and I did test this many times, so I'm confident to say it, this spell does not protect you from AoE spells like Fireball, Skull Trap, etc. So if you have these mirror images up and you're within radius of an enemy's or a friendly, but any AoE spell that's gonna hit you, that spell will look straight through the mirror image. So that just limits utility, right? You're going to use this to protect yourself from physical attacks much more so than enemy magic damage. It does protect against single target magic damage spells. So, for example, if a magic missile is cast against you, each orb is going to be treated as a single target attack against you, and each orb is going to separately check for whether it's going to take down a mirror image or hit your body as the mage. For chromatic orb, similarly, the damage will check to see whether it's going to hit one of the mirrors or you. The status effect will go through. So, chromatic orb raises the point, but it's an important point. Even though mirror image does protect against single target damage, it does not protect against status effects, which we'll look through. So, if a high level enemy mage hits you with a chromatic orb that would paralyze you, if you fail your save or spell, even if the damage aspect of the spell hits a mirror image, you still have to save versus the paralyze, the status effect. As another example, against Melf's acid arrow, the spell is gonna check each round whether the damage should be applied to the mirror image or to the caster. And if you dodge the very first Melf's arrow with a mirror image, none of the subsequent attacks will hit you, no matter what. So it's a pretty decent spell against Melfs. Against magic missile, mirror image is much less effective because each missile is going to check, which means that there's a high probability if somebody's firing 5 missiles at you that one of those missiles is going to get through. And that's why magic missile is a good. If you don't have ways to dispel enemy illusions, magic missile is a pretty effective way to interrupt casters that have mirror image up, or to just take down their mirrors, because each orb is going to check separately and either hit the caster or take out a mirror image. So just to summarize again how mirror image interacts with spells. If a spell has a status effect associated with it, like the status effects on chromatic orb, mirror image is not going to protect you. You're still going to have to save. If a spell is an AoE damage spell, mirror image is not going to protect you. Mirror image will protect you if a spell is a single target damage spell. And generally speaking, each instance of that spell attacking you or coming at you, such as different rounds of Melfs or multiple orbs of magic missile, are going to be separate checks against the magic missile. So I think what that really means is that mirror image is mostly about avoiding physical damage. It'll protect you against certain spells, but the fact that it's not going to protect you against AoE damage, to protect yourself against AoE magic, you're going to need to have different resistances. Protection from fire, protection from magical damage or magical energy, not mirror image. But mirror image does protect you against physical damage. And when you're at low levels and you just get access to this, that's by far the most common damage through all of BG1 and BG2. So it's nothing to sneeze at, but just pointing out what this spell is good at. I think to summarize, as soon as you get this spell, it immediately becomes what you want to stock, probably for all your level 2 spell slots, because it gives you some staying ability, especially if you're soloing. This is the only way to face up to tougher enemies at lower levels that are going to shred you with physical damage as a mage. There's still a lot of utility through SOA, and there's even utility through Thrown a Ball, given the quick cast time, the fact that it can be thrown off during an alacrity, and the longer duration and higher number of mirror images. This is still helpful to give your mage a little bit of extra tankiness for almost no investment at very high level. So this is the best level 2 spell. It's the one that it's the only one really that gives you any kind of noticeable power spike when you get access to it right away, and you're going to stock it all the way through the saga. Rating 8 out of 10. Quality spell. Not a game-breaking spell. You can live without it. It does lose some utility late TOB, but a high quality spell. The best spell in level 2 by far. 8 out of 10. Next up is Power Word Sleep. The duration is 5 rounds, cast time 1, area of effect 1 creature, and there's no save, but just wait. There are other limitations. When a wizard calls upon a Power Word Sleep spell, she causes a comatose slumber to come upon 1 creature, other than undead and certain other creatures specifically excluded from the spell's effects. The creature targeted must have less than 20 hit points and gets no saving throw. Magically sleeping opponents can be attacked with substantial bonuses. The sleep effect will last for 5 rounds. This spell has no effect on creatures with more than 20 hit points. Alright, it was right there in the description. This spell is not a good spell. If you compare it to other disables, it's inferior in every way. If you compare it to the level 1 sleep spell, it's single target, not EOE. It lasts 5 rounds only, versus level 1 sleep that lasts 5 rounds per level of the caster. And the big one, which is emphasized in the description, Power Word Sleep only works on enemies that have 20 hit points or less. It's almost insulting to the Power Word series of spells that they created this low-level version that sucks in almost every way and can only be used against super weak enemies. The 20 HP or less is calculated based on how much damage the enemy has taken. So theoretically, you could have a high-level enemy that you reduce below 20 hit points, and then you can put him to sleep to finish him off. And there's no saving throw, right? That would be the theory, that you get the enemy down to 20 HP or less, and then you hit them with this. But obviously, if you can take an enemy down to 20 hit points, take off their protections against spells and their magic resistance so that this spell is going to have any impact, then you probably have many, many other ways to kill that enemy. Just cast a magic missile, right? You're below 20 hit points. Cast a magic missile, cast a skull trap, and the enemy's just going to die. You don't have to disable them first. So, sort of silly. I guess it's kind of cool that as a mage casting level 2 spells, you can have access to a power word spell, but it's sort of like read the fine print. Power word only in name. I guess there's no save. That's why it's a power word spell, but this thing sucks. 2 out of 10. Next spell is Ray of Enfeeblement. The duration is 1 round per level, cast time of 2, area of effect of 1 creature, and a saving throw negates. By means of a Ray of Enfeeblement, a wizard weakens an opponent, reducing its strength score, and thereby the attacks that rely upon it. The victim is reduced to a strength score of 5 for the duration of the spell, unless a saving throw of her spell is made. This spell does not affect combat bonuses due to magical items, and those conferring increased strength function normally. However, the target receives all the penalties for a strength score of 5, such as attack and damage penalties, as well as lower weight allowance. Now, just the description would have you think that this spell has some utility against enemy fighters because of the weight allowance point. Everybody's been affected by some strength draining spell or just overloaded one of their fighters with too many Ankeg heads and been unable to move or been slowed. That's very effective against enemy fighters. Chances are they're using melee weapons. If they're stuck in place or slowed, then they can be kited and killed easily. However, what this description does not tell you is that the lower weight allowance effects of being encumbered actually do not apply to any characters except those in your party. So you can cast Ray of Enfeeblement all you want on enemies, and even enemies wearing full plate, and they're going to have no problem coming after you, even with a strength score of 5. They're going to move just as normal. I mean, that's bullshit. I don't know why the game is coded that way. This is already a pretty weak spell, given the single target nature of it, and the fact that a saving throw negates it. Why does it have to be further nerfed by making it so that the encumbering effect doesn't impact your enemies? That's just annoying. The game shouldn't work that way. And given that's the way that this spell works, I think the one situation where you could argue it's helpful would be against enemy fighters that are wearing a lot of armor to slow them down or make them completely incapable of moving. But with that gone, this really just becomes a mild debuff against enemies that has a chance to impair them, and it only lasts 1 round per level. So if you're at lower levels where strength scores matter and the enemies are going to miss their saves, then this is a pretty quick spell. It's over pretty quickly. It's hard to find any case for using it over much better crowd control spells like Sleep or Web. In summary, a spell that theoretically it should be fun because of the effect it should have on enemies, causing them to move more slowly or become stuck in place, but the game doesn't give you that. It doesn't make sense. I guess the only other thing I'll add here is that if you have Icewind Dale spells installed as a mod, there's a cleric spell introduced called Cause Disease, which reduces enemies' strength scores if they fail their save versus spell. So in theory, if you're a cleric mage or you have a cleric and a mage in your party, then you could use Ray of Enfeeblement plus the Cause Disease spell to reduce enemies' ability scores, their strength ability scores below 0, and therefore kill them. Because any character that has a ability score below 0 in this game will automatically die. It's one of the most satisfying ways to kill people in this game. They just sort of slump over, like their life force was drained, even though there's no blood animation that appears. It's pretty awesome. But that's sort of a stretch. That's a for fun stretch, right? You need the enemy to fail saving throw versus this spell to reduce the strength to 5, and then fail save versus the Cause Disease spell. And you only eliminate one enemy through doing that. Kind of a fun thing to do, though, if you're messing around. Overall, a pretty weak debuff spell, short duration, saving throw negates, affects their attack and bonus numbers, but doesn't affect their ability to move, even though they should be encumbered. And just not a very good spell. 2 out of 10. Next up is Resist Fear. Resist Fear has a cast time of 1, a duration fixed of 1 hour, regardless of level, 15-foot radius, and there's no save. But this is a buff, so it wouldn't make sense for there to be a save, really. The wizard instills courage in the spell's recipients, raising their morale to its highest. The recipient's morale will gradually reset to normal as the duration runs out. If the recipients are affected by magical fear, they will regain their composure. So what does this do? Well, first, it has a duration of about 5 turns or 50 rounds, so pretty good duration. That's an entire dungeon. It's a couple of different fights. You can put this up before you go and clear out a map area or a significant piece of a map area. The function of the spell is that it prevents the fear status effect and also dispels it if somebody in your party is already under the effects of fear. So it's called Resist Fear. Makes it seem like it just lowers the probability that you're going to be feared in the first place, but actually it completely removes fear and prevents it. You can cast it after a character has been feared and remove it, or you can cast it before a fight and prevent being feared. And this spell, I looked at the coding, it seems to be exactly the same to the Divine level 1 spell, Remove Fear. So resist, I don't know why, but when it's a mage spell at level 2, it's called Resist Fear, and when it's a divine spell at level 1, it's called Remove Fear. But either way, the effects are the same. Say at a high level, this is a situationally useful spell. It can protect you against wizards that cast horror, like at the bandit camp fight. Once you pop into the tent there, it can protect you against enemies with fear auras like mummies. But there are other ways to deal with those threats. First off, the Divine's level 1 spell, which is better, given that it's at level 1, and it's easier to use a Divine level 1 slot than to give up a knock, blur, or mirror image spell. Or you can use things like Potions of Clarity, the Greenstone Amulet, Minor Globe of Invulnerability. There's lots of different ways to avoid enemy horror spells or fear effects other than this spell. So I think this is situationally useful. If for some reason you don't have a cleric, then you could stock this spell. I think even if you're soloing and you're a high level mage, you're probably better off relying on your spell protections and high saving throws to avoid fear effects versus taking up a second level spell slot for this. So it's situationally useful, inferior to the divine alternative, and I'll give it a 3 out of 10. I think if we were talking about SCS here, where many more enemies have fear auras or use horror or fear effects, then this would probably be a bit higher, maybe like a 4 out of 10. But in EE, not that many enemies use horror against you. You're going to know about it ahead of time if you played through the game multiple times, and there's lots of different ways to stop that. Next spell is Stinking Cloud. Stinking Cloud has a duration of 1 turn, a cast time of 2, a 15-foot radius is what it affects, and a saving throw negates. When casting a Stinking Cloud spell, the wizard creates a billowing mass of nauseous vapors up to 90 feet away from her position. Any creature caught within the cloud must roll a successful saving throw versus poison at +2 or be sent reeling and fall down for 1d2 rounds. Those who make successful saving throws can leave the cloud without suffering any ill effects, although those remaining in the cloud must continue to save each round. A dispel magic will remove the nausea on a particular character, but if they remain in the cloud, then they are still subject to its effects. So the duration here, 1 turn or 10 rounds, will last through most of any fight. And what is this spell? At bottom, it's a crowd control spell, right? The effect of it, if saving throws are failed, is to put enemies to sleep or render them unconscious for 1d2 rounds. Now, to assess this, I think, as we do for many crowd control spells, as we did for Glitterdust and everything else, we're going to compare it to some other options. And I think the daddy spell to compare it against in this level would be Web. Let's compare Stinking Cloud to Web, right? Web is the other main crowd control spell at level 2. So, just comparing the spells. Same radius, 15-foot radius, between Stinking Cloud and Web. Same duration of 1 turn, or 10 rounds, for both Stinking Cloud and Web. Both are not party-friendly, right? So both of these spells could hit your party or enemies, so that's a push. And both stun or render enemies in a state where any attack hits them. So far, these are identical. However, now let's get to the differences. First, Stinking Cloud. If the enemy fails to save, then they get stuck for 1d2 rounds. This is actually a bit better than Web. Under Web, the enemy gets a save every round, and if the save is failed, then the enemy is stuck for 1 round. So this is marginally better. Half the time with a Stinking Cloud, you're gonna incapacitate an enemy for 2 rounds instead of 1. What about if we think about immunities? Well, considering immunities, Stinking Cloud is a poison effect. So Stinking Cloud will not work against any enemies that are immune to poison. So that's basically all undead. It's a lot of high-level enemies. Almost every high-level enemy in this game is going to be immune to poison. That means the Stinking Cloud has no utility in a lot of fights, even early on in the saga. If you're fighting undead, would be the main example. And by the time you get to mid SOA, and certainly in TOB, Stinking Cloud has this 0 utility. If you compare that to Web is just a regular spell with a save or a spell. It's not a poison attack, and so you can web anything. You can web undead. You can web anything that can be impacted by a spell, which is every enemy in the game except for 100% magic credits enemies. So Web is clearly superior when you're thinking about immunities. Now let's compare, here's the really key point of comparison, the saving throw dynamics to determine whether the spell is going to have any impact on any enemy. Stinking Cloud is a save versus poison, which equals a save versus death, with a +2 bonus for enemies that are saving. Web is a save versus spell with a -2 penalty. So let's compare these two things. Save versus death with +2 versus save versus spell for web with -2 penalty. First of all, it's important to note that enemies generally save more easily on a save versus death. Generally speaking, their death saving throw, which equals the poison saving throw, will be lower than the save versus spell. The impact of that is that lower D20 rolls will lead to a save versus death or poison than they would on save versus spell. So already, even if there were no bonuses or penalties applied, already web would be significantly superior to Stinking Cloud because web is a save versus spell, which enemies are less likely to make, and Stinking Cloud is a save versus death or poison, which enemies are more likely to make. Now, that gets even worse when you add in the fact that Stinking Cloud is a +2 bonus and web is a -2 penalty. We're talking about D20s here for save versus spell. So that 4 pip swing is a 20% swing. That's a huge spread. When you then factor in the fact that for most enemies, they're about 3 pips more likely to save versus death or Stinking Cloud to begin with, what you're talking about is something like a 35% swing or 7 pips in the difference between likelihood of saving versus web or Stinking Cloud. So that's just massive. So I'll give some examples here of some enemies that you might want to try to catch with these spells and how the math compares. So let's look at Asvart. Asvart saves versus spell at 17 and saves versus death at 14. So that means that Stinking Cloud saves at a 12, a roll of a 12 or above on a D20, and web only saves at a roll of 19 or above. So you're 8 times more likely to see a Asvart save versus Stinking Cloud than versus a web, right? 12 or up for Stinking Cloud versus only 19 or 20 for web. Let's look at an Ogre Berserker. Ogre Berserkers save versus spell at a roll of 10 and save versus death at a roll of 7. So that means that Stinking Cloud, they're going to save at a 5 or above 80% of the time. And web, they're going to save at a 12 or above. So they're about 2 times more likely to save versus Stinking Cloud, Ogre Berserkers. You can go on, but I think the major point is that enemies that are inside a web are way, way more likely, a multiple likely, 2 to 8 times plus, to get impacted by the effect versus Stinking Cloud. And that's just a massive difference. The other effects were a push or maybe mildly in web's favor given the immunities, but this difference in saving throws just makes web clearly superior. And given it's clearly superior, there's no reason to ever take Stinking Cloud. If you want crowd control that's not party friendly, you're clearly going to take web. It's just so much more effective. So we'll give Stinking Cloud a 2 out of 10. Not a good spell. Next spell in level 2 is Strength. Duration is 1 turn per level, so lasts a long time. Cast time of 9. Area of effect 1 creature. No saving throw. Application of this spell sets the strength of the character to 18 and then adds a 50% bonus on top of this. The character receives any strength bonuses appropriate. For example, if a character has between 1850 and 1800 strength, then her strength will just be set to 1800. If a character has strength between 1801 and 1850, then her strength will become 1850 plus original percentage. If her strength is less than 18, then it will just become 1850. However, this spell will actually lower a character's strength if it is already 19 or more. All right, there are a lot of numbers in there. Let's break down what this spell actually does. First, as I mentioned, long duration. One in real life minute per level of duration, or 1 turn per level. The cast time of 9 and that long duration is really suggesting this is something you're going to cast when you wake up, right? You're going to wake up, you're going to cast this on yourself or other party members, and then you're going to probably have it last until you rest again. And the spell can be cast on third parties. So there's this sort of theory that maybe enemies that are very high strength, you could cast this spell on them, given that there's no saving throw. But, you know, those types of enemies that have 19 plus strength, they're going to have a ton of magic resistance usually. And if you can hit them with this spell, you can probably hit them with much nastier things. So I don't really think that's very realistic. It's sort of fun to do maybe, but not very realistic. So this is really about buffing party members, and particularly about buffing party members before you get to mid SOA or TOB, when you have all these different items, the belts, cleric spells, etc., that make it easy to boost strength to 19 or above for your entire party. So it's really about BG1 through maybe mid BG2 before you become a wash in those items, and things like draw upon holy might, etc., scale to the point where everybody in your party is going to have 19 plus strength. So sort of an early game spell that doesn't scale too well, although the duration scales. The utility doesn't when you consider items that have permanent strength effects when equipped. Now, that was a lot of numbers in the description. Let's sort of break down how this works. First of all, you have to understand that there's two types of strength in this game. I assume that it comports with D&D rules. It seems unnecessarily complex, but there's a lot about this game that's unnecessarily complex. There's two components of strength. There's your regular strength score, ranging from 1 to 25, and then there's this extraordinary strength, which is only relevant between 18 and 19 strength. And extraordinary strength will change attack and to hit rolls and likelihood to bash chests and everything else that strength affects only in between 18 and 19 strength. So the strength scores in this game go from 17 to 18 to 18/01 all the way up to 18/99, and then 18/00 actually means 100 extraordinary strength. So that's the level right below 19 strength. So it goes 17, 18/01 all the way up to 18/00 and then 19. And let's break down what this spell does for these different, depending on what the starting strength of the person being cast upon is. The description does it a little bit, but I don't think it sort of goes into the nuance of the different impacts. So we will here. First, if strength is less than 18, strength becomes 18/50. So 1850 has the same THAC0 and damage, etc. bonuses as being 18/01. There's no difference, 1850 versus 1801. So it's really just for optics that it's a higher number. At this strength, you're getting -1 to your THAC0 and +3 to damage. And the bonus is the same whether you started with 8 strength or 15, and it tapers from there. So for starting strength less than 18, this is a decent buff, right? You're moving from maybe no damage bonus all the way up to getting -1 to THAC0 and +3 to damage. If your strength is 18 flat for a non-fighter class, right? Because only fighter classes get extraordinary strength. If your strength is 18 flat, then the description doesn't specify this, but it still sends you to 1850. So if you were at 18 flat beforehand, you had +2 to damage before getting cast this spell on you. And after the spell cast on you, you move up to +3 damage. So your only buff is +1 to damage. So not really worth casting this on people who have 18 flat strength. Less than 18, there's a decent case, right? You're moving to +3 to damage and -1 to THAC0. If you start with 18 flat, you're only getting +1 to damage. Don't bother. If your starting strength is 18/01 to 18/50, then strength is increased by 50 exceptional strength points. So the impact of this depends because of the way that exceptional strength works. The impact of adding 50 exceptional strength points is to add -1 THAC0 and somewhere between 0 and 3 damage. Obviously a huge range. 0, adding just -1 THAC0 and 0 damage would be a complete waste. But adding -1 THAC0 and +3 damage is awesome. So how does it work? If you're exactly 1850 to start, then you get +3 damage because you move from 1850 to 1800. But the odds of that are really slim, right? I don't know if you have to roll 1850 at the character creation screen. If you're from 1801 to 1825, then you get +0 damage bonus because you're going to move from 51 to 75 exceptional strength. The impact of that is 0 damage bonus. So for anybody that's from 1801 to 1825, don't cast this. It's bad. You just get -1 to THAC0 and +0 to damage. If you're at 26 to 40 exceptional strength, you get +1 damage from this spell. If you're at 41 to 49, you get +2. So there's sort of this bizarre effect where the higher your starting extraordinary strength, the higher the benefit from this spell, right? Because if you're at 01 to 25 extraordinary strength, you get no damage bonus. If you're at 26 to 40, you get +1. If you're at 41 to 49, you get +2. Sort of counterintuitive. And the opposite would apply if you're between 1851 and 1899, in which case you're set to 1800. You cap out there. So there you again have a change of up to -1 to THAC0 and +3 to damage, with the increase of damage decreasing as your starting extraordinary strength is higher. So you have diminishing returns. That's more of what you'd expect, right? The higher your starting extraordinary strength, the less of a buff you get from this spell. So to continue on, if you start at 1800, then this spell has no effect. So anybody who has 1800 starting strength, I don't know if there is anybody, probably it would just be you. If you rolled that in the character creation screen, this spell has absolutely 0 effect, never cast it. And if you're at 19 or above, this would actually reduce your strength, so you should never use it. So I think to summarize, the most obvious use case is for somebody with 15 or length or less strength. That person is going to get -1 to THAC0 and +3 to damage from this spell. It's pretty significant. And so, if you have NPCs in your group, low strength fighters like Khagan or Khalid, Khagan has 16 and Khalid has 15 strength, they can really benefit from this spell. You're doing 3 to 4 APR at higher levels, so you're adding about +12 damage per round in BG1. That's nice. But for certain NPCs, this spell would have much less of an impact, right? Maybe 1 THAC0 and 1 damage, according to the parameters I just went over. So it's very dependent on what starting strength is, and it's a nice buff if you're getting the max impact, which is for lower starting strength fighters. Or starting strength fighters that have weird ranges of extraordinary strength, like Shartil at 1858 still gets -1 THAC0 and +3 to damage. But other than that, we're getting +1 damage, -1 THAC0, not incredibly significant. And as you get to later in the game, you're going to have access to all kinds of items that do this better and for longer duration. So in summary, it's situationally useful, especially if you're playing with a party early on. Maybe you're a fighter mage that chose not to put points in strength for whatever crazy reason. So situationally useful, but later on by, mid SOA and certainly by TOB, this spell loses utility relative to items. So I give it a 4 out of 10 rating. And, God bless you if you stuck with all of that technical explanation of how this impacts THAC0 and damage depending on starting strength. So we have 2 spells left. Second to last spell in level 2 is Vocalize. Duration is 1 turn, area of effect the caster, casting time 2. The recipient of this spell can cast spells with a verbal component without having to make any noise. Effectively, this spell cancels the effect of silence and makes the recipient immune to it for the spell's duration. This spell has no effect on other noises or speech. It simply removes a spell's verbal component. So, This spell, first of all, it's not a catch-22. It's the only spell in the game that you can cast while you're silenced. It sort of doesn't make sense. Why would you be able to cast this spell while you're silenced before you're vocalized, but no other spell in the game? I don't know. Otherwise, the spell would have almost no utility. So from a practical perspective, I see why that is the case, but it's true. If you're silenced, you can cast this spell. If you're silenced and you're not vocalized, this is the only spell in the game that you can cast. So really, this spell is about countering silence. If you have it up and you're silenced, the silence will have no effect. If you're silenced and you cast this, it's the only spell you can cast, and it'll immediately enable you to cast further spells from that point. Silence is extremely powerful if cast against you and you fail your save versus it. As a mage, you're going to be completely unable to cast any spells. So it's very rarely used, but also very powerful. So, there's an argument that you should keep this stocked if it's your first playthrough of the game and you're not sure when you're going to be silenced. Definitely, if you're going up against clerics or an SCS, there's more enemies that will try to silence you. You can prep for it by stocking this spell. But still, very few enemies are casting silence. They probably should be doing it more often because it's a very powerful way to eliminate or not have to deal with enemy mages, but it's very rare. This spell is the answer, though, and it's the only answer. The only practical answer. You can try to dispel magic or certain things like that, but you're going to remove all your buffs as well doing that. So Vocalize is really the only practical answer. But thinking about the spell big picture, in early SOA, you get access to the Amulet of Power, which is the best amulet for any spellcaster, and that comes with permanent Vocalize. So, immediately you're the top mage in your party, or yourself if you're a mage, you're immediately taking that amulet, and you're never stocking Vocalize ever again from early SOA. And at higher levels, you're going to have other ways to avoid being silenced. You're going to have globes of invulnerability. You're going to have very high saves versus spell. You're going to have spell traps and spell turning up. And again, if you're the top spellcaster in your party, you're going to have Amulet of Power. So this is situationally useful. I think I can't give this a 2 out of 10 because because it is the way to save yourself if you're silenced in sort of in BG1 through very early SOA. But it's still highly situational. It has one use, and when you do use it, you're taking up an entire round just to enable yourself to cast further spells. I'll give this a 3 out of 10, mainly because of the presence of Amulet of Power and the rarity of enemies casting silence. Last spell in level 2 is Web. Save one of the better ones for last. Duration is 1 turn, cast time of 2, 15-foot radius area of effect, and a saving throw negates. A web spell creates a many-layered mass of strong, sticky strands, similar to spider webs but far larger and tougher. The web spell covers a maximum area of about 15 feet in radius, roughly the same as the size of a fireball. Creatures caught within webs or simply touching them become stuck among the gluey fibers. Anyone in the area when the spell is cast must roll a saving throw versus spell with a -2 penalty. If the saving throw is successful, then the creature is free to move out of the area. A failed saving throw means that the creature is stuck in the webs, unable to move. Each round that a creature remains in the web, it must make a saving throw or be unable to move. Well, it's probably the best all-in offensive spell in level 2. We already talked about how Mirror Image is by far the best spell, and Blur is pretty decent as well, as is Knock. And now thinking about offensive spells, the damage spells in level 2 are highly underwhelming, with Melf's probably being the best, but still not being good. And that means that this spell, Web, which is a great crowd control spell, one of the best crowd control spells in the game, is probably the best offensive spell in level 2. I think there's a few things to highlight. We've been over this a little bit through talking about Stinging Cloud as a comparator, but webbed enemies, so enemies that fail their saving throw here, they get hit every time, right? And this thing goes for 10 rounds, and each time they need to save. So The flip side of being able to save each round is that enemies have the opportunity to free themselves from the web and no longer be stunned. But the shot to stun or chance to stun an enemy 10 times in a row is pretty valuable, more valuable than the risk that they would escape. Because once an enemy is stunned, every attack's going to hit that enemy, and so it's easy to focus down that enemy as soon as they've been affected by the web. So it's nice to have 10 shots to stun an enemy for a round, given that the stun effect is very powerful and you're going to be able to focus that enemy during the round. And considering the -2 penalty, the way the math works out is that low-level enemies in BG1 are going to fail their save about 50 or 75% of the time. So over 10 rounds, almost every enemy that you encounter in BG1, unless they have free action or they're one of the toughest enemies in the game that have super low saves for a spell, you're going to catch enemies in this over the 10 rounds. It's just going to work at some point in those 10 rounds. The odds are in your favor. The most devastating use for this is probably to cast this either through a spell trigger to cast it multiple times, or just if you don't have SCS installed, then enemies will just sit off screen. You can have them slightly out of your vision and cast this spell before going into a battle. If you cast it multiple times, those multiple instances of the spell will stack, meaning that some very tough fights become extremely trivial through the use of web and ranged weapons, especially without SCS, when the enemies will just sit there off screen. You can easily solo the tough fight outside of the Cloakwood Mines, casting webs just at the edge of your field of vision. You can solo the parties of 4 that appear near the exit to the Nashkel Mines and in the Mutiman's Garden area with web. You can use it to good effect in the top of the Iron Throne. That tough fight, although one of those enemies is wearing a ring of free action. There's just lots of different fights that the enemies are standing there. You can throw down a few of these pre-fight if you want to be cheesy as hell, and enemies are going to get stuck. And you obviously don't want to enter the web yourself unless you have free action up or a globe of invulnerability or something that'll protect yourself. But with ranged weapons, this spell becomes very powerful, and especially in BG1. There's really only 2 knocks that can be said against it. Obviously, it's not party friendly, and second, because it relies on saves, there's limited scalability here, right? Late in SOA or through Throne of Ball, enemies are going to be saving against this even with the -2 penalty to saves. And they're also going to be having high magic res, and a lot of them will have free action. So, there's limited scalability, but at the level, and certainly through BG1, this is a strong spell, probably the best offensive spell in level 2. And if you like crowd control, if that's the way that you like to play, then this is a very quality spell. Personally, I prefer to kill enemies rather than incapacitate them, and I think that webbing enemies off screen is a pretty cheesy way to play, so I favor damage or buff spells over web, and at level 2 I'll be taking Blur or Mirror Image more than this spell, but it's a quality spell. I give it a 6 out of 10. That concludes level 2 of Arcane Magic. Hopefully you learned something. Again, one of the weaker spell levels. I think, to summarize, Mirror Image is by far the best spell. It has scalability. It does the most important thing that a buff can do for your mage, especially at low levels in BG1 through mid BG2, which is protect against physical damage. It's going to interrupt your casting and deplete your small HP as a mage. And there's a few other quality spells here. Blur, Web, and Knock are in the next tier, and Detect Invisibility, and Melfs have some utility throughout the saga. Other than that, there's a lot of garbage here. A lot of spells down at the 2 tier, and you have your joke spell, No Alignment. Big picture in trilogy runs, level 2 spells are not terribly consequential. You can have fun with them, but I'm usually taking mostly mirror images Blur and Knock, and then very late game switch to some Acid Arrow to fight some of the very high resist enemies that appear in Throne of Ball. Thanks for watching this, and hopefully I'll be able to get level 3 out before 10 months from now.